One night. One warning. One touch that changed everything. The evening began quietly, almost too quietly, with the soft hum of conversation and the faint clinking of glasses in the art gallery. I wandered through the exhibit, alone but not lonely, letting my gaze drift from one painting to the next. There was a strange comfort in observing other people's work, the brushstrokes, the choices of color, the tiny details that revealed the artist's inner world. Yet, amidst all the canvases and sculptures, my attention was drawn to something, or someone, entirely different. She stood a few feet away, her posture relaxed but unmistakably confident, examining a painting with an intensity that made me pause. She looked to be in her early 40s, graceful and striking, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that naturally commanded it. Her hair, softly curled at the ends, caught the warm light of the gallery, creating a halo that made her seem almost ethereal. The subtle scent of her perfume, a mix of jasmine and warm vanilla, floated through the air, drawing my senses closer without a word being spoken. Our eyes met briefly across the room. There was a flicker of recognition, or maybe curiosity, in her gaze, and I felt a flutter in my chest that I hadn't expected. I looked away too quickly, embarrassed by the intensity of the moment, yet unable to stop stealing glances at her. There was something in the way she held herself, poised yet approachable, that made me feel both nervous and strangely grounded at the same time. I moved closer to the painting she had been studying, pretending to be interested in the art, though my attention kept drifting back to her. Her fingers traced the edge of the canvas lightly, as if absorbing the energy of the piece through touch. She tilted her head slightly, and for a brief instant, her hair brushed against my shoulder as I stepped nearer. The contact was fleeting, accidental, yet it sent a small, electric pulse through me, a silent acknowledgement of proximity that neither of us verbalized. I wanted to speak, to break the quiet barrier that seemed to hover between us, but my voice faltered. Words felt clumsy and inadequate compared to the subtle communication happening in glances, in small movements, in the almost imperceptible brush of her fingers against the painting frame. She looked up, and for a moment, our eyes locked again, not just noticing, but observing each other with a quiet curiosity, as though we were both aware that this encounter was different from anything ordinary. Finally, she offered a small, fleeting smile, almost as if acknowledging a shared secret that hadn't been spoken aloud. Then, just as suddenly, she turned away, moving toward another part of the gallery. My chest felt tight with a strange mix of disappointment and anticipation. I realized, with a surprising clarity, that this unexpected encounter, brief, wordless, and loaded with unspoken emotion, had stirred something within me that I couldn't ignore. It was a moment that promised more, a delicate spark in the dimly lit gallery, leaving me aware of her presence long after she had walked away, and setting the stage for the slow, simmering tension that was after our brief, fleeting encounter at the painting. I wandered deeper into the gallery, feeling her presence linger in my mind like the faint trace of a melody I couldn't quite place. Then, as if guided by some quiet force, I found her again near a marble sculpture. She was studying it intently, her posture relaxed but attentive, her fingers hovering just above the smooth surface as though she could feel its history through her fingertips. The light caught the soft waves of her hair, and the faint scent of jasmine and vanilla returned, subtle and intoxicating. I approached cautiously, my heart thumping louder than I expected. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" I asked, gesturing toward the sculpture. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, and she turned to me, a small, curious smile playing at her lips. "Yes," she said softly, her tone thoughtful. "I love how something so simple can convey so much emotion. It's human." Her eyes met mine, and there was a warmth there, quiet, but undeniable. I noticed the way her head tilted slightly when she spoke, the way her hand rested lightly on the sculpture's base, her fingers brushing the smooth marble ever so gently. I couldn't help but feel the intimate tension in that small, deliberate motion, as though she was inviting me into a private world without saying a word. We began talking about the piece, and soon our conversation drifted effortlessly into life beyond the gallery. She spoke of her work, her travels, and the books that had left an impression on her, and I found myself sharing in turn, carefully, thoughtfully. There was a rhythm to our words, a give and take that felt natural yet charged with subtle undercurrents of curiosity and admiration. As we talked, I became acutely aware of the smallest details: the faint way her sleeve brushed my arm when she gestured, the soft sound of her laughter that seemed to linger in the air long after she had stopped, the gentle way her eyes tracked mine when she listened. There was a magnetic pull in these minor gestures, a quiet intimacy that seemed to bridge the gap between our years and experiences. I realized that the age difference, which had felt like an unspoken boundary at first, now seemed almost irrelevant. What mattered was the honesty in her voice, the softness in her gaze, the unspoken acknowledgement of mutual curiosity and interest. A moment came when our hands accidentally brushed as she adjusted her stance to get a better view of the sculpture. Neither of us pulled away immediately. Instead, we lingered, sharing that brief contact, and I felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through me, a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and anticipation. That fleeting touch, seemingly inconsequential, carried a weight that neither of us could ignore. By the time she turned her attention back to the sculpture, I felt a quiet bond forming, not rushed, not overt, but subtle, deliberate, and entirely magnetic. There was the beginning of something unspoken, an emotional tether that pulled us toward each other even as the gallery continued around us, oblivious to the delicate, simmering connection that was unfolding between us. And as she smiled once more, briefly, knowingly, I realized that this quiet encounter had transformed the evening from ordinary into something charged with possibility, leaving me both exhilarated and acutely aware of the slow, careful journey that was just beginning. The conversation at the sculpture lingered in my mind as we moved through the gallery together, our footsteps quiet on the polished floor. I was aware of her presence in a way I hadn't anticipated, the subtle warmth radiating from her, the soft cadence of her voice, the way her eyes seemed to absorb everything around her before focusing on me. Every glance carried layers of meaning, and I found myself reading her gestures with an intensity one didn't quite understand. As we reached the gallery's exit, she paused near the doorway, her hand lightly brushing against the edge of a display. She turned to me, her expression calm yet edged with something I couldn't immediately place, a mixture of hesitation and intention. "Would you like to continue our conversation somewhere quieter?" she asked, her voice soft but deliberate, almost like a gentle invitation into an unspoken world. My chest tightened at the implication. "Sure," I replied, a little too quickly, my voice betraying a mixture of excitement and nerves. My mind raced, aware of the age gap between us, aware of the social boundaries I might be crossing, yet unable to ignore the pull she had over me. There was something in the way she lingered near the door, her posture casual but deliberate, that made saying no impossible. We walked a few blocks to a nearby cafe, the evening air cool against my skin. The world outside felt muted, as if it existed only to frame the small, intimate bubble we were stepping into. Inside the cafe, the golden glow of hanging lights softened the space, and the aroma of coffee and baked goods mingled with the faint trace of her perfume, a combination both grounding and intoxicating. We found a small table near the window, and she chose the seat closest to me, her leg brushing gently against mine as she settled in. I felt the warmth from the contact, subtle yet electric, and I noticed the rhythm of her breathing, steady but inviting. The space between us felt smaller than necessary, yet neither of us seemed inclined to adjust it. There was a quiet intimacy in proximity, in the small adjustments of our bodies as we oriented toward each other, creating a shared zone of comfort and tension. As we spoke, the conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on lighter topics, favorite books, the music that moved her, memories of trips she had taken, and deeper ones, like the choices that had shaped our lives. She laughed softly at a story I told, her hand brushing mine briefly as she gestured, the touch lingering just enough to make my pulse quicken. Every glance, every gesture felt deliberate yet natural, as if the universe had conspired to place us together in this quiet, suspended moment. I was acutely aware of the subtle power in her presence, the warmth of her arm when it accidentally touched mine, the soft tilt of her head as she listened intently, the way her eyes lingered just a moment longer than polite conversation would demand. Each small, almost imperceptible action drew me closer, emotionally and physically, without ever breaking the gentle tension that hung between us. By the time we finished our drinks, I realized that the evening had already shifted something inside me. The invitation, simple and unassuming, had opened a door I hadn't known I wanted to pass through, leading me into a connection both thrilling and quietly profound, the slow burn of something far more significant than either of us had anticipated. The cafe felt quieter now, as if the rest of the world had slipped away, leaving just the two of us in a bubble of warm light and soft murmurs. The earlier excitement of curiosity and subtle tension had given way to something deeper, a fragile intimacy that neither of us had yet dared to name. I watched her, noticing how her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, lingering in thought, her eyes distant for a moment as if weighing whether to reveal something she rarely shared. Finally she spoke, her voice soft and tentative, like a carefully placed brushstroke on a blank canvas. She confided a personal struggle, perhaps a recent heartbreak, or a professional decision that had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Her eyes met mine briefly, searching for understanding before darting away, hesitant to expose too much. There was a subtle vulnerability in her posture, a quiet tension that spoke louder than words. I leaned slightly closer, careful not to intrude, yet wanting to show that I was present and attentive. "I understand," I said gently, keeping my voice low, steady. "You don't have to carry it alone." The words felt small in the face of her vulnerability, but I sensed they mattered. Her hand moved, almost imperceptibly, to rest on mine for a fleeting moment. The contact was light, almost casual, yet the warmth of her skin, the softness beneath my fingers, sent a ripple through me. It was a touch that conveyed trust without words, a silent acknowledgement that she had chosen to let me in, however briefly, into her private world. She shifted slightly closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her arm. Her hair brushed my shoulder as she leaned to confide a detail too intimate to share aloud elsewhere. The proximity, accidental or deliberate, felt charged. I was aware of her heartbeat, quiet but steady, and the way her breath brushed past me in soft whispers as she spoke. Every subtle motion, the tilt of her head, the brief glances, the way her hand lingered, created a tapestry of closeness that words could never fully capture. The cafe noises seemed to fade around us. Each pause in her story allowed me to offer quiet affirmation, each small smile or nod a reassurance that her feelings were seen and respected. I realized that this shared vulnerability, this moment of honest exposure, was deepening our connection far more effectively than laughter or small talk ever could. By the time our conversation wound down, there was a palpable shift. The initial spark of curiosity had evolved into trust, tempered with a quiet yearning. I felt protective, drawn to her fragility and strength simultaneously, and aware of a new layer of emotional intimacy forming between us. She looked at me with a softness that made my chest ache, a silent question lingering in her eyes. Would I stay close, even when the moment ended? And in that delicate, fleeting exchange, hand on hand, breath near breath, words soft and unforced, I understood that our slow, careful journey toward each other had moved a significant step forward. What had begun as fascination had now begun to root itself in genuine care, setting the stage for the moments of tension, trust, and closeness yet to come. The evening had deepened into a quiet intimacy, the kind that makes the world beyond the cafe feel distant and unimportant. Our conversation had softened into pauses and shared smiles, and the slow rhythm of our words was punctuated by brief, meaningful touches. I was beginning to feel that rare, almost dangerous comfort of being fully present with someone who seemed to understand me without explanation. Then, as if sensing the need for clarity, she paused. Her gaze held mine with an intensity one hadn't seen before, firm, unwavering, yet not unkind. Her fingers lingered lightly on the table, tracing subtle patterns, betraying the tension beneath her calm exterior. And then she said it, her voice low, deliberate, carrying both caution and something almost fragile. "If you tell anyone about tonight, we're done." The words struck me with an unexpected weight, a mixture of warning, trust, and unspoken desire. There was no anger, no reproach, only a clear boundary wrapped in a quiet vulnerability. It was as if she was placing a part of herself in my hands and asking me to hold it carefully. My heart raced, and for a moment, I struggled to process the sudden intensity of the moment. Before I could respond, she leaned forward, closing the distance between us. Her hands came to rest lightly on my shoulders, then slid slowly down my back as she pulled me closer. The motion was gentle but purposeful, intimate without being overtly romantic. I felt the warmth of her chest against mine, the subtle strength in her hold, the softness of her hair brushing my cheek. The scent of jasmine and vanilla enveloped me completely, grounding me in the immediacy of her presence. Time seemed to stretch as we stayed like that, bodies close but not claiming, connected in a way that words could never fully describe. My pulse quickened, a mix of anticipation, awe, and the quiet thrill of being trusted so completely. The warmth of her touch seeped deeper than the physical. It spoke to the emotional closeness we had been nurturing, confirming the silent bond forming between us. Her eyes searched mine as if reading my thoughts, gauging my reaction to both her warning and the intimacy of her gesture. I realized that this was more than a test of trust. It was an invitation to step fully into a connection neither of us had dared to name yet. My breath caught as I felt the subtle electricity in the air, the unspoken tension of desire tempered by respect, care, and the understanding of boundaries. We lingered like that for what felt like an eternity, a suspended moment of emotional and physical closeness that neither of us rushed to break. When she finally eased back slightly, the warmth remained, the echo of her presence imprinted on me. Her gaze softened, a quiet acknowledgement that this connection, fragile, thrilling, and dangerous, was ours alone. That night, in that brief, potent moment, I understood something profound. Trust and desire could coexist in delicate balance, and the slow burn of our connection had reached a defining point. The warning, the pull, and the closeness were not threats or mere flirtation. They were the foundation for the intimacy that would continue to grow between us in the days to come. The moment at the cafe lingered in my mind long after we had parted ways. The warmth of her presence, the softness of her touch, and the weight of her warning replayed over and over, leaving a mixture of thrill and quiet awe in its wake. I walked home slowly, tracing the contours of our conversation and the subtle electricity that had passed between us, aware that something had shifted irrevocably. Days passed, and yet I found myself thinking about her at odd moments. The way her eyes had held mine, the delicate brush of her fingers against mine, the faint scent of jasmine and vanilla that seemed to linger in the memory of her touch. Each thought carried a pang of longing and a subtle ache of anticipation. It was a slow, simmering awareness that the connection we had shared was not fleeting. It had taken root and was quietly growing stronger. Then, by chance, our paths crossed again. It was unexpected, ordinary almost, a chance meeting in a park where she was reading on a bench bathed in golden afternoon light. And yet, the ordinary setting felt infused with significance. Her gaze found mine, and in that instant, the air seemed charged with unspoken recognition and understanding. We greeted each other with soft smiles, a subtle acknowledgement of the memory we shared. She sat slightly closer than necessary, her shoulder brushing mine, and the warmth radiated between us like a quiet pulse. There was a rhythm to the moment, not hurried, not intrusive, but deliberate, each movement carrying layers of familiarity and curiosity. As we spoke, the conversation flowed easily, lighter than our previous encounters yet underpinned by an unspoken intimacy. She laughed softly at something I said, and I noticed her hand brushing my arm casually, lingering just long enough to remind me of that evening in the cafe. Each small gesture carried the weight of shared trust and growing affection. I felt an acute awareness of the delicate balance between distance and closeness, between restraint and desire. Her presence was both comforting and electrifying, a quiet acknowledgement that our connection was special, fragile, and entirely ours. The age gap, the social hesitations, the unspoken rules of propriety, they all existed, but in that moment, they felt manageable, almost irrelevant, against the depth of the bond forming between us. By the time we parted again, the sense of lingering connection was undeniable. I watched her walk away, feeling the warmth of her proximity still radiating, and realized that the slow, careful dance of trust, attraction, and emotional intimacy had reached a new level. We had moved beyond curiosity and tentative gestures into something more substantial, a shared understanding, a quiet bond, a feeling that the world could pause while we existed in our own rhythm. Even after she was gone, her presence remained with me, in memory, in touch, in the gentle echo of shared laughter. It was a reminder that the slow burn of our relationship was alive and growing, that each interaction, each glance, each subtle touch, was a thread weaving us closer together, preparing us for the emotional resolutions and deeper intimacy that were still to come. Days stretched into a quiet rhythm after our second encounter, and yet the memory of her lingered with an almost tangible presence. Every small detail, the warmth of her hand against mine, the soft brush of her hair across my shoulder, the gentle cadence of her laughter, replayed in my mind, weaving a comforting tension that neither time nor distance could erase. I realized that our connection had grown into something subtle yet undeniable, a slow-burning bond that existed as much in thought and feeling as in physical presence. Then, unexpectedly, our paths crossed again, this time in a sunlit bookstore. The familiar scent of paper and coffee mingled with her unmistakable perfume, creating an intimate cocoon that made the outside world fade away. She looked up from a shelf, her eyes meeting mine with that same quiet intensity, a spark of recognition and warmth that immediately made my heart beat faster. It felt less like a chance encounter and more like a continuation of a story that had already begun. She smiled softly as she approached, and I noticed the subtle ways her gestures had become familiar, the tilt of her head when she laughed, the slight way her hand brushed mine as we exchanged books, the gentle warmth that radiated from her as she lingered nearby. There was no rush, no pressure, only the natural rhythm of two people who had discovered a connection that neither time nor social expectation could diminish. We settled into a small corner with our chosen books, sitting close enough that our shoulders touched lightly. The proximity was comforting, grounding, and yet carried an electric awareness of intimacy. Her fingers brushed mine as she turned a page, a fleeting touch that made my chest tighten with quiet anticipation. Our eyes met, and for a moment, words became unnecessary. The shared understanding, trust, and affection were expressed simply through presence and gentle gestures. As we talked quietly about literature, life, and the small moments that mattered to us, I realized how far we had come. What had begun as curiosity, intrigue, and subtle tension had evolved into a deep, emotionally resonant bond. We could linger in silence without awkwardness, touch without hesitation, and smile without pretense. The age gap and the unspoken boundaries had not vanished, but they were no longer obstacles. Instead, they framed a relationship built on patience, respect, and the slow, careful growth of trust. Before we parted, I brushed a strand of hair from her face, letting my fingers linger slightly on her cheek. She allowed it, her eyes soft and knowing, and placed her hand briefly over mine. It was a small gesture, yet it carried the weight of connection, of shared moments and unspoken promises. In that instant, I understood that the slow burn we had nurtured, through glances, touches, laughter, and vulnerability, had reached a point of emotional fulfillment. As she walked away, our hands parting reluctantly, I felt a quiet warmth settle in my chest. The story, though complete, left a lingering sense of possibility, of trust, and of affection that would continue to grow with each encounter. Our connection, forged slowly and carefully, had found its resolution, a gentle, YouTube-safe intimacy that was emotionally satisfying, deeply human, and profoundly hopeful.